Good day, Junior Tuckies. I am Mrs. Breedenkamp, and in today's lesson, I will be teaching you about the different types of poetry. Let's get into it. What is a narrative poem? Just like a narrative essay, a narrative poem is when a poet writes the poem from their perspective. A narrative poem tells the story of both the narrator and the characters in the poem. A ballad and an epic story falls under narrative poems. Narrative poems contain full storylines, just like the traditional elements of a narrative story. These elements include characters, plot, conflict, resolution, setting, and action. Narrative poems were the way in which people told stories that they passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. Let's look at an example on the next slide. An extract from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more." Now, I know this sounds super complicated, but it actually isn't. You will see over here that I've highlighted the areas in which we can see the elements of a narrative poem. Once upon a dreary, this tells us the time and setting. Poe uses I, so this can qualify as a narrative poem. Suddenly there came a tapping. Poe is letting the plot unfold. 'Tis some visitor. Once again, the narrator is telling the story. This is just an extract of the poem, so we won't see all of the elements in this example. What is a haiku? A haiku is a very specific style of poetry that has a regimented or strict structure and rhythm. There are only 3 lines with a total of 17 syllables. The first line is 5 syllables. The second line is 7 syllables. The third line is 5 syllables, just like the first line. Punctuation and capitalization are up to the poet, and they need not follow the very rigid rules that we use in normal grammatical structuring of sentences. Let's look at examples of a haiku on the next slide. Pressed against my shoulder under the cherry blossom, whose petals will fall. Here you can see a simple haiku. 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first, 7 in the second, and 5 again in the last line. Let's look at the next one. What is poetry? If all it needs are the words to make you feel loved. Once again, using those incredibly rigid structural elements to create a haiku. All of you should know what rapping is. But do you know that it's actually just poetry put to music? Think about your favorite rap song. Not Migos or Travis Scott, but other rappers, like 50 Cent or maybe Tupac. Look up the lyrics to their songs. You will see that they've actually created poetry and put those words to a beat, which usually ends up in becoming a song. Let's have a look at how rapping can be seen as poetry on the next slide. Examples of rap in poetry. This is Dear Mama by Tupac Shakur. I've inserted a hyperlink for you to watch the music video to hear these lyrics put to a beat. I'm definitely not going to sing it to you. In this extract from the song, Tupac is telling the heartfelt story of how his mother raised him and his siblings. He explains how difficult it was for her to have a son in a time where gangsterism was so rife. So next time you're listening to rap from today, why don't you browse Spotify or YouTube Music for an artist like Tupac, who wrote meaningful and sincere rap lyrics. When I was young, me and my mama had beef. 17 years old, kicked out on the streets. Though back at the time I never thought I'd see her face. Ain't a woman alive that can't take my mama's place. Suspended from school and scared to go home, I was a fool, with the big boys breaking all the rules. I shed tears with my baby sister over the years. We was poorer than the other little kids, and even though we had different daddies, the same drama. When things went wrong, we'd blame mama. I reminisce on the stress I caused. It was hell, hugging on my mama from a jail cell. And who'd think in elementary, hey, I'd see the penitentiary one day. What is a ballad? A ballad is a type of poem that tells a story and was also originally set to music. This is one of the oldest forms of poetry. Because it was set to music, it was a lot easier to remember in the 1300s. Remember, people didn't have many things to entertain them in, and many people were illiterate. So, creating ballads was a way to keep yourself and others occupied. A ballad had 4-line stanzas. The rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, but this isn't always the case. Most ballads sound like a song or have a lyrical quality to it. Ballads also may contain refrain, which is repetition, of a line or stanza throughout the poem. Think about it, just like a song. A ballad has a very specific rhyme scheme and meter. What is meter? Meter is a pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables that creates a rhyme in poetry, almost like a song. For example, la-dee-da, la-dee-da. Can you hear how the tone of my voice has been changing? The most common meter is called iambic pentameter, and this is the meter usually found in older ballads. This just means that there are 5 stressed syllables and 5 unstressed syllables in each line. The rhyme scheme of a ballad is also unique. As I said in the previous slide, it is A, B, C, B. Let's actually look at an example from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, Annabel Lee. I was a child and she was a child, and in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with love that was more than love, I and Annabel Lee. Can you see how C and Lee rhyme? Let's have a look at more examples on the next slide. There are 3 different types of ballad. First up is the folk ballad. These ballads were used to tell stories and were usually passed down from generation to generation by word of mouth. Putting these stories to music help people remember the stories better. An example of this is just Robin Hood. Then, number 2, lyrical ballads or literary ballads are poems that were inspired by music, and that is why poems usually have this strong rhyme scheme. Then number 3, we get modern ballads. Modern ballads include modern songs and poetry of today. These days, the rules of rhyme and rhythm does not always apply to a modern ballad. As long as a story is being told, a song may be considered to be a modern ballad. Pop songs that speak about love are derived from the original style of ballad writing. An example would be Sweet But Psycho. Let's have a look at the link between poetry and shape. Typography is when the contents of the poem matches the layout of the poem. Punctuation, stanza length, placement of phrases, and the blank spaces in between all contribute to the look and style of the poem. Look at the example I've inserted onto the slide. The poem is called The Fall. Doesn't the poem's structure actually illustrate the title? Let's read the poem and find out. I sit with the arms around legs, pulled tight together. The world spins around me, and soon I'm spinning too. Eyes squeezed shut, holding tight, round and round like a top on a table. My grip loosens, one arm and one leg fall out, like an unfastened sail, rippling, waving in the wind. And then, set goes, I am falling, shattering, and contact with the ground, coming totally undone, in bits and pieces. After reading this poem, we can see how the poet has carefully thought out where each and every single word should be placed in order to create this falling effect. Let's look at more examples on the next slide. Our first example over here is called rainbow. Red, sweet as honey, bitter as blood. Orange, fluttery as fall, still as a stone. Yellow, loud as a trumpet, soft as a petal. Green, rough as a pine cone, smooth as a lake. Blue, my color, just like the sky. Indigo, bright as the moon, dark as night. And then purple, weak as a flower and strong as courage. Over here, this is a beautiful example of how the words also match the colors of the rainbow. We can see that each line of poetry not only represents color, but also it's shaped exactly like a rainbow. Let's look at the second poem, Raindrop. A drop of rain is like a sudden knock at the door, unexpected, yet often welcomed with a smile. It can brighten your day or ruin your plans. It can make you laugh or can make you sad. Whether the raindrop is moving fast or slow, or is big or small, it always gets everyone's attention. A raindrop contains many secrets. It is a bubble of anticipation and surprise. It cleanses the earth, it feeds the flower and fills the holes. The raindrop is never silent. It bangs on the roof, splatters on the window, or splashes into a puddle. A raindrop. Once again, the poet has carefully crafted this poem to embody and illustrate a perfect little raindrop. That's it for today, Junior Tuckies. I hope this lesson sincerely helped you understand the different types of poetry. Next up is the analysis of poetry.